All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Alan, and I'm not usually driving this bus, but tonight I am. Welcome to the Heavy Metallurgy Album Club review series, where each week one of us picks an album for everybody to listen, kind of pick apart, develop some thoughts about it, and then come back the next week and share with the group. Usually, of course, Marty is in the driver's seat, but he is currently at the Halloween show in Michigan, having a great time. It's his son's first concert, so really cool one for him to start with, seeing Hammerfall on Halloween. And as such, I agreed to kind of, take the wheel tonight. TJ also could not make it at the last moment. I think he secretly snuck off to the Halloween show as well and just didn't want to let everybody knows that he's now a full convert into, happy European power metal. It kind of isn't, with his normal shtick. So he's got to kind of keep that on the down low. I guess I just outed him. Sorry, TJ. But regardless, we do have two of the regulars here with Kellen and Jim. Guys, how y'all doing this week?
Fantastic. Still recovering after last weekend's Glorious Dead and Panopticon show.
Yes, we were just talking about that backstage for anybody that somehow completely missed it. Glorious Dead and Panopticon played in Louisville, and by all accounts, folks had a great time. Bands played excellent. A lot of folks got to hang out, including both of these fine gentlemen. So sounds like a great time was had by all. And hopefully at some point in the near future, when things settle down a little bit, maybe like y'all plus Marty plus Ben, maybe even Austin can, do some kind of, a cast, give everybody kind of a post-concert, rundown of how things went and get some different perspectives on it. It'd be fun to hear from everybody on that one.
Yeah, seeing Jim's hair flail in the stage lighting, it was definitely a highlight of mine. One of the best moments of the entire concert, for sure.
Very
That's
cool.
why they call me Silver Vortex, man.
Jim is definitely known for the hair. My wife's always like, "Is the guy with the hair on?" She always forgets your name, but she's like, "Is the guy with the great hair on?" I'm just like, Jim, yeah, the Pantene guy. Yes, he'll be on tonight. So she likes watching you just for the hair.
I'll take it.
Good deal. All right, but yes, tonight we're not going to be discussing Halloween, and we're not discussing Panopticon or the Glorious Dead. Last week, it was Kellen's turn to pick an album. And Kellen, would you like to tell folks what you chose for us tonight, although it's probably pretty obvious from the thumbnail?
Sure. So if you haven't caught it by now, this is High on Fire's 2002 release, Surrounded by Thieves, that I selected for us. And we're going to dive into that this evening.
That we are. And so I'll try to follow Marty's normal template, which I believe always begins with aping Wikipedia, the ultimate source for information on all hard and heavy bands. But yeah, so we've got the entry. High on Fire is an American heavy metal band from Oakland, California that was formed in 1998. Matt Pike is the band's frontman and founder. He also plays with the doom metal band Sleep. And High on Fire won the 2019 Grammy Award for Best Metal Performance. I got to ask you guys, we always hear about this every year. Is it a good thing for a band to win this, or does it completely destroy their street cred? I've always wondered, do you want to win the heavy metal Grammy, or do you feel like, oh God, please pick anybody but me? What do you think?
I mean, I think that first off, they won that award because I believe the Electric Messiah was dedicated to Lemmy.
Okay.
So I just feel someone in the academy is like, oh, a Motorhead reference. Well, they should get a Grammy. I don't think they actually know anything about the career or
yeah.
Plus, this band has been around for over, I guess, 2 decades, right?
Yep, over 2 decades now.
So if it takes you 2 decades to win a Grammy, it's not like they came out the gate, and won a Grammy. It's like they have an entire body of work, to lean into. And out of all the bands that we'll kind of get into this later, but out of all the bands that sort of emerged for me when I was kind of getting into metal back at the end of the 90s and early 2000s, they've aged relatively well for a 2-decade career. So there's worse candidates to be given. And at this point, like, I don't have a problem with it. So go for it.
Fair enough. Jim, what do you think about the whole metal Grammy category?
Well, for the most part, I think the Grammys are, a joke, self-congratulatory, wankery. People, congratulating one another that are on the same like record sales level. I have absolutely no interest in the Grammys or the Oscars or anything that kind of self-congratulatory. Hey, you're an actor. I'm an actor. Let's you're awesome. Here's a trophy. I just don't understand that. I'd rather listen to the opinions of my friends. So I pay zero attention to that. But of course, I did hear about High on Fire's win, and I was actually kind of happy for Matt, because the guys, he's been in two very seminal bands, Sleep and High on Fire. And he's overcome a lot. He was, really into hard drugs and kind of pushed himself close to death. And now he's, as far as I know, anyway, he's in recovery. And so, I think that, when you've gone through those kinds of life changes, and then to be, to get some kind of recognition that you never saw coming. So for him personally, I'm happy for him. I think, in terms of my opinion on, its value, I think it's meaningless. I don't ascribe any value to any of that. But on a personal level for Matt, I think it's cool. But ever since Jethro Tull won over Injustice for All back in 1989, I've that was pretty much the last time I watched the Grammys. And so yeah, it for me it's like neither here nor there. And mainly the people in the Academy. I think if it's the Academy, whatever the hell they call those guys that make the decisions. I mean, I've seen over the years like Korn being nominated and things like that. I mean, it seems to me that most of those people are like, in a gym and their trainer is telling them like, listen to this and you'll lift harder, man. Oh, by the way, we should make them a Grammy nominee. So that's my thing on it.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Mine's kind of the same. I couldn't care less about the Grammys as a set of awards. And yes, you very much get the sense that they're just like, flipping through the charts. Is there a band that made, at least 6 figures worth of, physical copy sales? Okay, maybe they get it. Who knows? But at the same time, it's not bad for the bands, I don't think. And anything that gives, pop culture, mainstream people a little bit of a glimpse at heavy metal. There's some kid out there who is going to hear the name High on Fire for the first time because of the Grammy. And it may be just enough interest to be like, Electric Messiah. I wonder what that sounds like. And it'll get them to go click a YouTube button. And who knows, that could open up some doors for them into, things that, aren't Taylor Swift. So there's always a chance for it to do some positive work, even if those of us already in the know, the whole thing's a little eye-rolly. All right, so let's get into things with this album. Our first order of business is to discuss our first impressions of the album. And see, Kellen, it was your pick, and we'll start with you. What was your first impression of Surrounded by Thieves?
So when I first heard this record, there was already a little bit of lore surrounding Matt Pike specifically and Sleep as a band. So I went into High on Fire, in particular, the first time I heard Hung, Drawn, and Quartered, which was the first High on Fire song I heard. And I went into it thinking I'm going to get another sort of Sleep clone, and I got something very different. I had a difficult time placing it initially, but what I discovered about the band is they have kind of a special something going on. Like, sure, there are some stoner doom sort of roots, which was a kind of a popular sound at the time around the turn of the millennia, but there's a different kind of identity once we get into songwriting. I'll kind of dive deeper into that, but they had something special to offer. And what was cool is as the band sort of gained popularity and attention, I kind of went along with them throughout the 2000s. And I still kind of, as a consequence of this record and Hung, Drawn, and Quartered as a song, it serves as a really important band for that 2000s era for me. And one that I sort of return to consistently with a great deal of like fond memories from that time period in my life. So my initial sort of thoughts there for you.
Okay, good deal. Jim, what's your backstory with High on Fire and your first impression of Surrounded by Thieves?
Well, the first time I heard the name was, I spent a good portion of my life in Atlanta, Georgia. So, Mastodon was coming up, and, they were just about to get signed to Relapse and everything. And then, after they got signed, I can't remember, I ran into somebody at across the street from where they used to play, which was a Star Bar. And they were telling me the story, which was that, Brent Hines had booked a High on Fire show in the basement of the house that he was staying in. And High on Fire came into Atlanta and played there. And that's where he met the other two guys, not the bass player, but the drummer and the other guitar player. They showed up to that show. The guys who used to play in Today's the Day.
Right.
And so that was the first time I heard the name, hearing the story about High on Fire. I was like, well, who's High on Fire? and I kind of like forgot about it. And then later on, I stumbled across their third album, the one after this, Blessed Black Wings.
Yep.
Yeah. And I loved it, man. I Devolution, it was heavy. It was awesome. And I was never a Sleep fan, and I'm still not. I like it, I don't hate it, but I just kind of felt like it was kind of boring to me. It was like the same riff played 1,000 times. The songs were too long. I just couldn't. I was like, it sounds heavy and it's cool, and I like the guy's vocal, but I just never understood Sleep. But when I heard High on Fire, I was like, now this I can get into, man. I loved Matt's voice. I loved the energy and the feel behind it. And to this day, it's still my favorite High on Fire album. So when I went back to this one, I kind of listened. It was for High on Fire, it's Blessed Black Wings Up. And for whatever reason, I just never really checked out the first couple of records. So I actually hadn't heard Surrounded by Thieves, which is weird because I own a bunch of their CDs. But so listen to this. At first I was like, oh, okay, like, he hadn't quite went full on metal yet. Like there's a lot of, Sabbath in here. It's kind of like sped up Sabbath. So at first, like that was kind of my first impression was like, okay, he hadn't quite, because there's no like alternate picking like there is on Devolution, where it's like really fast, kind of thing. But subsequent listens that I dug more, and I was like, wait, I hear it now. There's a little bit of like Frost in there, and just like really aggressive percussion. And so first impression was very like fast Sabbath. But subsequent impressions, I saw where he was about to go, where he was really about to cross that line and to pull in more like, 80s, like, underground thrash, into his sound and his style some more, which everybody knows he's a huge Frost fan, which is awesome. So, but yeah, so definitely it was cool to feel that, fast Sabbath thing. I like that phrase. I'm going to keep saying that tonight. But also the evolution as it grew on me throughout the week was really cool to see and to really understand where he was about to head. So it was awesome.
Okay, good deal. Let's see. My own take here. I gotta try to move myself over to the right side of the screen. There we go. Yeah, my take here. I have very little history with this band. It's a name I've always, of course, heard over the years. They're a pretty visible band. I just never really checked them out. There's not a reason I skipped them. One thing that always happened, I would ask people, okay, High on Fire, what do they sound like? And it's one of those bands people always wanted to give annoyingly complex answers about. And be like, oh, they've got like all these different sounds combined. It's like, try to like imagine like if Iron Maiden was playing Motorhead, but they had like a sludge angle, but there's like, this thrash vibe. And I'm just like, that makes no fucking sense whatsoever. What are you talking about? So it was just like, thanks. No thanks. If I can't understand what you're saying, I'm just not going to dive into it. A couple of years ago, I got a copy of Blessed Black Wings. It just showed up at used bin, one of the local record stores. I'm like, okay, for $6, I'll give it a try. I've played it a handful of times, and to be honest, it's never really connected with me. It's a little, for me, it's kind of typical of what was happening with a lot of American bands in the 2000s, 2000, 2010 range, where it's meant to be aggressive. The vocals are kind of shouted. The drums are starting to get way out front more and more. And these just aren't traits. It's not, a style for my generation necessarily. But that was really about all I knew about the band. So when I saw this was the album before that, I'm like, okay, it'd be interesting to see what they were doing a little earlier in their career. And first impression for this one is that it sounds pretty different from Blessed Black Wings. It's obviously got a very different production. That's something that stood out right away. It's got this very kind of fuzzy, muddy production to it. There's a lot of aggressive tones going on, but yeah, the production's the kind of the first thing that stood out. On first listen, I didn't love the album, but I didn't hate it either. I was like, okay, this immediately sounds more interesting to me than Blessed Black Wings did after the first listen. So we'll keep spinning it this week and see where it goes. And came to like quite a bit of it. It's not perfect. There's some things, I'm not nuts about, but I do like this one a lot more than Blessed Black Wings, actually. So, and those are the only two albums I have, so that's the only thing I can compare it to. I don't know anything else from the band's catalog, really. I've heard a few songs here and there, but nothing that ever made me want to follow up. But yeah, this particular album did grow on me as I got used to it. And I like the style that they're playing at this phase in their career. So, all right, those are our first impressions. Now, we always try to have one, thought question tied into the album. And since it was Kellen's pick this week, Kellen got to come up with the question. And so I will read what question came up with for the group to ponder. And Kellen kind of alluded to this a little bit with his earlier statement, but he said, High on Fire arrived on the scene back when I was in high school, and Matt Pike, for me, stands as one of the key heavy metal musicians during the 2000s. Between his work with Sleep and High on Fire, he's a historically impactful player, notoriously wild and always shirtless frontman, a generational figure. And so the question then is, are there certain individuals, figures, musicians, just, one or two who personally define your teenage years or, specifically your high school years? And are there any musicians today who you think of, being on kind of a similar level or, thinking of in a similar way? So, Kellen, since it's your question, we'll start with you, and you can expound upon this, or if there are other examples besides Matt who you'd like to kind of reference in this context.
Yeah, I mean, so for me, when I was thinking about a question here, I just have a very particular memory with this band. This would have been in the between Blessed Black Wings and Death is a Communion, so it would have been 2006 or so. And I actually was in college at the time, and you'll appreciate this, Professor. So it was a weeknight, and for a lot of the bands that are touring on the West Coast, they come up I-5 essentially. So they move from California, they drive through Oregon, head up to Seattle, so on and so forth. And Eugene, where I was going to school, the University of Oregon, sort of sits in between like your whatever California show, like San Francisco. They're from Oakland. And they would probably had like on a weekend show on a whatever Saturday, they'd go to Portland. They stopped over in the middle of the week in Eugene. And so this was like a weird Wednesday, Thursday. Mm-hmm. And one of my best friends, it was his birthday. And so I bought him a ticket, and he was not really into metal. He's really into punk, but I decided I'd take him to this show, right? So we should have been at home studying and preparing and doing our homework and all our reading and so forth. But I was like, no, I want to drink and party and go to a metal show. So he drove me to the show, and I just remember he got there, and the place was, because it was the middle of the week, relatively empty. So we like got a chance to move right to the front, and Eugene's not really a big city, especially back at the time when I was going to school there. Anyway, he looks at Mac Pike on the stage, and at that point in time, he had this massive custom 9-string first act guitar, and he sits there. He's just whatever, shirtless. This guy, and then just a 3-piece, so it was super stripped down. But they launched into the performance, and at some point in the evening, my friend looked at me and was like, "Holy!" Like just the idea of a figure like that pulling people to a stage, you know, getting interest. He's an incredibly talented player. Like there's a lot of, he's influenced by John McLaughlin, who's you know, played in Mahavishnu Orchestra, which is like a jazz fusion. So his lead playing, especially on a 9-string at the time, was really unique. Anyway, that made an impact, and I was trying to think of like if there's anyone today for who I have the same kind of association with, because I really don't. That kind of like guitar hero god figure, who I don't know if it's because there's so many bands nowadays, or because, you know, now I'm in my, you know, mid to late 30s. I don't have the same connection with younger bands, but I couldn't think of any. I couldn't think of like a kind of player like that now, specifically like a guitarist, lead frontman who I have the same kind of connection with. So first, I was just curious for both of you, right? So that there's like a personal side of this. You remember that time period in your life, certain people who grabbed you. And then beyond that, like, you know, is there anyone today who you have a certain kind of affection with? So.
Okay. Let's see. So Jim, what do you think? Anybody that kind of this strikes a chord with in your memories?
For metal, back when he still had hair and used to wear 10-inch nails on his armband, I really looked up to Kerry King as a huge, 80s era Slayer fan. I just thought he was cool as shit. I loved he would, because he was supremely, it still is supremely arrogant, would wear his own shirt, Slayer shirt. And my favorite one was the upside down cross in the graveyard with a severed arm holding on to it. It's bleeding out. And I actually bought that shirt recently. I love that shirt. and I had a big poster of that. And I hung up and metal enough in my basement in my parents' house. We called it the dungeon, and it was complete metal. Me and my brother, we had old couches down there and stereos and posters of metal dudes all over the place. And so that one was like front and center. And but as the years went by, and Kerry King kind of like became Kerry King, he fell off my radar pretty hard. And I'd gotten a little pissed off at Lemmy for always denying that he was metal. I can't stand when bands that play heavy say they're not metal. But when I finally understood that he was old as hell and he played in the 60s with Hawkwind, kind of makes sense. He's like, I'm before punk, I'm before metal, I'm not either one. You know what I mean? And I really, and when I kind of started embracing that, and so really for me, the only I guess heroes you could say that kind of followed me into my old age were Lemmy and Johnny Cash. Everything about their the way they kind of overcame adversity but always remained true to who they were. Like I always admired that about both of them, and I still do, and I sort of see them as icons, that kind of like transcended their humanity in terms of, the attitude that they embodied that were, that anyone who decided to, step outside the lines a little bit could identify with, where you got, the man in black, you've got, who just, he was more than country. He had a little bit of punk rock in him. He hooked up with Rick Rubin when he did all the dark stuff there. And of course, Lemmy's just Lemmy. Nothing more to be said. But those guys, definitely, from their attitudes and and the fact that even in their old age they were putting out some quality music, always inspired me. And another character that I always, and was really affected by his death was Chuck Schuldiner. Death's probably my favorite band, because there's very few bands that I like every record they put out, and Death is one of them. There's like maybe only one or two more, and I didn't see it coming. It was really surprising. I mean, but I sort of was close in age to Chuck a little bit. He was I was probably 5 years younger, but how he went from like full on metal, let's dig up zombies, let's eat guts. And then he sort of got more philosophical as he aged, and lyrically, and the kind of things that he tackled. Like I was sort of going through those same sorts of developments, at the same time, and so I really identified with Chuck, and so yeah, I would say that probably those three, and I can't pick between the three of them. I'm not even going to try, but all three of those, individuals, through their music and also, their growth as people, or in Limmy's case, complete lack of growth. I mean, there's something to be said for that as well, and so, they all, I found like little bits of myself in all three of those guys. And I think a lot of other people did too. So.
Okay. Yeah. Good answers. Very well thought out. My answer is not going to be nearly as good because I really haven't thought of anyone that kind of fits the bill here. And I do think I figured out why I couldn't come up with a good answer. Just based on my age, I fall in kind of a little bit of a weird gap with what was going on musically. I'm just young enough that a lot of the big heavy metal personalities from the 1980s had already kind of gotten established, and some of them were already getting a little bit past their prime by the time me and my classmates were discovering these bands. You think of folks like Bruce Dickinson, Rob Halford. We got those albums and liked them, but when we were getting into heavy metal, they were putting out No Prayer for the Dying and Turbo, and albums that aren't their best necessarily. See, Tommy, thank you very much. Really appreciate that, man. Glad you made the show. I saw your comments beforehand. I'm glad you could make it tonight. Same with people like Dee Snider and Blackie Lawless. They were huge media magnets for a lot of kids about 3 to 5 years before I was paying any attention to heavy music. The closest person I could think of, someone that I should have really gravitated towards, is like the musical tour de force of my generation, is actually outside of metal, and it should have been Kurt Cobain, because Nirvana hit my senior year of high school, but by that point I was already pretty entrenched in heavy metal, and so I didn't mind Nirvana. It was kind of interesting, but it was never quite heavy enough for me. I didn't mind it, but I was again, probably just a year or two too old to completely get sold on the grunge train either. But yeah, Cobain probably would have been the one that I was supposed to gravitate towards, but just missed that boat. At the same time, I just missed the boat of really being a huge, blown away by someone like a Kerry King or a Dee Snider, or even an Ozzy for that fact. I mean, obviously, kids in my class, we found out about Ozzy. People bought Ozzy records and Black Sabbath records, but I'm trying to remember. I want to say the first Ozzy album that came out when we were actually buying our albums for the first time might have been No More Tears. It wasn't Bark at the Moon, or Randy Rhoads was dead and long, long gone. And there's another example that could be a huge one for this kind of question, but Randy Rhoads had passed away years before any of us were paying attention to heavy music. The other aspect of it is I'm not a musician, so I never had that kind of connection. It was never like, this person's, guitar playing blows me a boy and inspires me to play. I grew up in a rural area where if anybody played anything, it was a banjo. And that's not, people might play guitar, but it was all country music. It was bluegrass kind of stuff. You couldn't learn to play classic guitar or rock guitar or anything. It wasn't an option. And as such, it never, I never identified with, metal musicians, on that kind of level either. So yeah, sorry for kind of the lame answer, but I really couldn't come up with someone that, as an individual defined, that high school teenage era for me. There were lots of bands and albums that did, but it was never that there's this one person. Even Motorhead, in a way. Lemmy's a great pick, Jim, but what would have been the Motorhead album that came out around the time we were getting into things? It would have been, I don't know what came after rock and roll. 1916, March or Die. March or Die is not a good album. So again, I mean, like the first one I remember hearing was Orgasmatron, and that album sounds nothing like the rest of the Motorhead catalog. It's a good album, but it's weird sounding. So yeah, I couldn't really come up with an answer. Sorry about that. It'll probably be like, I'll be going to bed tonight, and the perfect answer will finally hit me a bit. No, I forgot to mention Ted Poley. How could I do this? I'm sorry, Ted. But yeah, a cool question for sure. All right. Definitely. Then next thing on our checklist is to discuss musicality and composition. What do we think of the way these guys are playing and how things are put together? So, Kellen, it's back to you.
Yeah, so I guess the major sort of theme or band identity that made this unique, coming from a presumably stoner background, was epic heavy metal usually cast the listener or the lyrical content from the vantage point of the protagonist, like hero worship music, right? You're always the warrior good guy. If you were to like take the heavy metal context, the epic heavy metal thing, and you sort of flip it, and you were to stick, what do the bad guys listen to? It would be the High on Fire stuff. Like this is the like evil warlord, worshiping ancient forbidden gods, battle, acts. This is like the bad guy music, right? This isn't like hero worship music. There was something about their sound before necessarily I understood it as genre music. I always thought of it as like tribal warfare music. And so I guess sonically, Jim's going to talk about this being like sped up Sabbath. For me, it was like thrash crawling out of the mud. Like there's this you can hear they want to move at a faster pace, especially on this record relative to Art of Self-Defense, the record that came out in 2000. That one's even, you can hear more and more of sleep pouring into that sound. This is like they're starting to turn the wheels into something a bit more dynamic. So more traditional heavy metal influences, mentioned, Celtic Frost, but even another one that you could potentially bring up is like the straightforward attack that you got from someone like Venom. They're from the Bay Area, so I think thrash is a part of this sound, something like Slayer. The lead playing style is coming from almost like a jazz fusion side of things. So I can understand how complicated when people were like, what does this band sound like? And they give you a litany of strange genre definitions to describe them. Surrounded by Thieves, in my opinion, sees them starting to incorporate more traditional heavy metal influences. And it's, for me, like this weighted, heavy, but interestingly dynamic kind of stoner thrash thing going on. What happens is the riffs for me, like I think this is still very much Matt Pike's band, but everything is buoyed and amplified and given a sense of velocity with Dez's drumming. There's like this consistent sort of circular tom work happening as a part of their sound. And I always thought that like drove home the feeling of this being like warlord music. There's something about the way he plays the toms where it feels like a fundamentally different kind of approach to how you would play metal drumming, where it's something you can add weight and momentum by not just doing snare, kick, whatever crash ride sort of deal. He's spending a lot of time sort of working through the toms at this mid-pace sort of thrash velocity, and that to me goes hand in hand with the songwriting style. They're able to get by with less sort of variety and dynamic swing relative to a more traditional thrash album per se, because there's this added element of sort of tribal warfare kind of drumming going on. And that's for me every time I listen to High on Fire, and in particular, I think the two albums that you have, Alan, Blessed Black Wings, and if you listen to this one here, Surrounded by Thieves, that for me, that's this band at their apex. But I think this record, to your point, it's even less thrash inspired. Once you get to Blessed Black Wings, there's a bit more of that like double kick sort of attack thing going on. It's a bit more of a traditional thrash sort of dynamic in between the instruments. But this, for me, is very much a slower to mid-paced record with some moments of up-tempo sort of thrash stuff. But every single piece of their songwriting style, I feel, is complementary, meaning like they know as an identity what they want to be, how far they want to push the envelope at this stage in their career. And it matches like the whole aesthetic that they're going for. All these sort of murky, dark lit, evil, sinister characters, swinging axes like on this one, or, perched on a dark demon sort of on the Blessed Black Wings image. They've got a whole thing going. Like, it's a vibe. It's not just a sound. They understand what they want to be, and probably Matt understood what he wanted to leave when he moved away from Sleep. So that's kind of their songwriting style. Over the years, I think they became a little bit more like the disparity in the sound between there's some really slow, heavy stuff, and there's some very, very fast stuff, a little more technical playing. This feels to me like a sweet spot where the disparity in the dynamics are a little bit less divided. It's closer concentrated in terms of the sound. But for me, it kind of hits a sweet spot. So I think relative to their career, that's kind of where I find them on this record.
Okay. A few points there I'm definitely going to circle back to, but it's not my turn. It is the fellow with the fantastic hair's turn. So, Jim, musicality and composition. What are your thoughts?
One thing that Kellen said, I think is right on, about him, really wanting to make a statement, post Sleep, he wanted to do something different, still related, still him, because those are his riffs on those Sleep albums. That's him playing the Jerusalem riff 100 times or whatever. But, whether or not he felt confined, or whether or not it was just, out of anger, whatever, for whatever reason, Matt decided, you know what, I'm just going to speed this thing up, play it faster, be more aggressive. Definitely not just guitar wise, but vocally, obviously he wasn't, the vocalist in Sleep, but his vocals here couldn't be any more different from I don't even know the guy's name in Sleep because I'm not a fan. So, but whoever the guy's name is in Sleep, it's that differentiation that makes me like High on Fire, because everything that Sleep is about, I'm not into. It's repetitive. It's super slow. And I'm okay with it, but I'm never in the mood for it. I actually think is more interesting. The band that the other two guys did without him.
Right.
But High on Fire, when I heard it, I was like, hey man, this is cool. This is like Sleep but fast and with more riff variety. I mean, he, with Matt's guitar playing on this, obviously the lead work is awesome and cool and interesting. It's like if Kirk Hammett didn't have a wah pedal and didn't play the same scales over and over again, that would be Matt Pike. You know what I mean? That's kind of what I hear. You know what I mean? A more interesting lead style. And before anybody starts throwing rocks at me, every cool melody line in a Metallica song, guys, was written by James, just so you know that, and recorded by him in the studio. So, but anyway, So I think the musicality of this album is for me right on. I love that he's, you know, all over the neck playing these like thrash like riffs, but playing them open chorded like Tony Iommi would. So it's still got that same sort of thrash velocity to it, but without, like, you know, what you and normally associate with thrash, which is kind of like, you know, the palm muted down picking kind of a thing. He's down picking whole open chords, you know, and all over the neck doing it, moving constantly, and it making it sound good, making it sound really thick and warm, you know, most stoner metal, with the exception of early Elder, which we all know what my opinion on that stuff is, is most of it is really thick sounding, you know, a really thick distortion guitar, and especially with High on Fire, you know, the bass, the guitar, and the drums, you know, it's you know, everything in that studio. It's like, you know, let's take out all the, you know, really, you know, really super high sounds. Let's pull up the mids and the low mids, and let's make this our sound. You know, kind of like, you know, the Masters of Reality Sabbath sound. You know, I mean, that's what this is, but with more intensity and a higher amount of delivery. So I really like it. And, you know, something that Kellen pointed out. Yes, man, the drumming on High on Fire is super interesting to me because, you know, there is a you know, a little bit of like double bass on Blessed Black Wings, but there is none on the first two High on Fire albums. You know, this one that I heard, and I correct myself from earlier, I actually did have a CDR burned of our Self Defense, and on that one he plays what would be double bass on the toms. Just to your point, Colin, like his tom work replaces that double bass. So it's an interesting style. And while I was like going through listening to this album this week, I was like, you know what, you know, if Sabbath played faster, see, I told you I'm gonna keep coming back to that. This is what, Bill Ward would have done to get that double bass sound. He would be rolling on those toms, you know, and he did do that, you know, on like Children of the Grave and stuff like that.
Yep.
That was the double bass of that era. And so this guy took that, but brought it to its like modern equivalent, like what would be what we think of double bass, which is that rolling, you know, syncopated, constant rhythm from the mid to late 90s onward and into death metal. He's doing that, but, you know, like rejecting the toms, and you know, the pure metalhead in me, like, is a little annoyed by it in a way, which I know sounds counterintuitive, but I feel like it's like, hey, we're kind of metal, but we're too cool to be metal, you know, and you know, that kind of stuff pisses me off, you know. But you know, I as I've gotten older, I kind of leave all that stuff behind, you know, and I'm like, I just judge things on the merit of the music, not for, like, you know, what scene they were trying to create or who they were trying to associate with. Though, let me tell you, that's a very real thing. You know, I mean, you know, living in Atlanta, there was like the bearded guys who listened to stoner, and then there was the metal guys, and they did not get along at all. You know, we didn't go to each other's shows. There was no support, you know. And so it kind of took me years to really embrace like the beard metal stuff, like High on Fire, pretty much anything that was on Relapse in the early 2000s, you know. Even Mastodon. I thought Brent Hines was a dick back then. I still think he's a dick. And yes, I've met him personally. He's a dick. But anyway, I digress. But yeah, musicality, I think what they've done here was, you know, really something different, man. You know, they took stoner metal, which by and large I'm not interested in, and made it interesting by putting traditional heavy metal sounds and some frost in there too. On Eyes and Teeth, that last riff, that could have been something that Tom G. Warrior played on. To go back and listen to the first track, Eyes and Teeth, listen to those last couple riffs. That could have been something off to make a theory on. And, you know, and as we know, he covers the Usurper later on and stuff like that. We all know that Matt likes Subceltic Frost, which that's the way into my heart. You know, you know, you can be beard metal all day long, but if you like the Frost and you scream it from the mountaintops, I'm going to be buying your records. That's that's just how it is. So, but anyway, yeah, I think what they did here, you know, whatever the motivations were, it ended up creating a band that was just utterly original, and I think that they continue to be. When you put on High on Fire, to me, when I listen to High on Fire, no one else sound. This is, I recognize it immediately, and so that's to their credit. So,
All right, good points. Let's see. Well, again, I didn't have much, you know, background or history with the band coming into this. Just had really one other reference point. for just sheer musicianship and everything, yeah, there's a lot of good stuff going on. Good at writing riffs. The drum work stands out. I like the way you described it, Kellen, that yeah, there's a lot of emphasis on the drum. There's a lot of rolling. The toms are emphasized. At the same time, they stop just short of allowing the drums to take over the music. That's a pet peeve of mine with certain bands like Mastodon at times. uh, a good drummer makes a band great. A lead drummer is distracting. When you've got somebody who just constantly has to be doing something just for the sake of it, to the point that it's no longer part of the song, I'm out. I don't want to hear a guy play a 48-minute drum solo while some other guys are trying to play a riff in the background. I think they hit a good balance here where, yeah, the drums are doing something interesting, it's dynamic, and yeah, it adds a lot of energy to the songs. While the riffs are good here, when you combine them with the song structures and the production that we'll talk about in a minute, there are times that some of these songs could start to bog down a little bit or get a little too repetitive. But there's always the drums moving. There's always that kinetic energy from the kit that keeps propelling things along, so that even when they repeat the riffs, a few extra times, a couple extra measures, the drums are still pushing everything forward. So I liked that about the album quite a bit. And to your point, Kellen, that about like the kind of this is kind of like the dark side of epic metal comparison. I very much got that too, because after a couple of listens, a light bulb finally went off. I was like, I know what this is reminding me a lot of now. It's this, and somebody north of the Rockies mentioned it in the chat a few minutes ago. These guys sound a lot like Gates of Slumber from the early and mid 2000s. If you're not familiar with them, Gates of Slumber are more of an epic doom metal band. The difference is that, yeah, Gates approached it, from that kind of traditional, sword and sorcery fantasy kind of epic infusion into doom metal. The cover art, song titles like, Lair of the Ice Worm, it's all Robert Howard, worship in and out. But yeah, you listen to like, the vocal styles of both these guys, they're coming from kind of the same place. They're trying to get that same kind of very gruff, world weary, rough and tumble sound to themselves. A lot of the overall playing, they're trying to do similar things. It's just that Gates goes in that kind of the heroic epic direction more, and High and Fire, kind of like you said, Kellen, they're going for a little bit of the darker, grimier vibe on it, where it's rooted a little bit more in some stoner rock traditions. Even though, as to your point, Jim, this isn't the slow, boring, let's just drag the song out for 21 minutes with 3 riffs for the hell of it. These songs are meant to move forward. They're meant to hit you, be aggressive, wrap up, and move on to the next one. But yeah, I was kind of impressed that it suddenly was like, just change a few little things about Gates and they would sound more like High on Fire. And if you just changed 1 or 2 things about this High on Fire album, it would sound like something out of the early Gates of Slumber catalog. Along the same kind of lines, I also find myself, hearing things like Saint Vitus in the overall vibe of this album in a lot of places, just between, the, general tone they're going for, both playing and with the production helping that along. Which kind of brings me back to something I mentioned earlier. A lot of folks have always tried to describe this band to me as having a very complicated, mesh of sounds. I don't think that's necessary. Yes, there's pieces of things here and there, like you mentioned, Jim, with the Celtic frost riffs and stuff. But for me, at the heart of it, this is a band that's got a heavy dose of doom metal in it. It's just a more aggressive version or style of doom. They're not going to let it plod along or drag out. They want the aggression of more traditional metal stuff, that kind of thrash influence, but they want it wrapped in these more stoner and doom trappings. And as such, it works pretty well. I like the way that it turned out. Once I got my head wrapped around it and kind of like, all right, I know what this is now. I kind of can see what they're doing. I think it came together really cool. So that would be my take on it. Next thing is the production. which is very different from the albums that came after, because this also, they switched producers after this album going into Blessed Black Wings, so they got a pretty different sound. Kellen, what do you think about the production on this one, and maybe even compared to, you know, how it changed after this recording?
Right. So like this record and Blessed Black Wings are actually some of my favorite records to compare and contrast, specifically like nuances of guitar tone.
Mm-hmm.
For me, the transition from Billy Anderson to Steve Albini, which is the transition in the producers, it's one of the more stark moments in their catalog. Like Jim mentioned the track Devolution, which kicks off Blessed Black Wings. There's like a sort of guitar slide before it launches into the thrash riff in that song. And there's a whole lot more clarity in the guitar tone. One of the things that Albini did is really tried to emphasize like the sort of textural leading edge aspect of Matt's playing. This, by comparison, feels so much more veiled. There's a certain degree of like where the bass sound and the guitar sound are sort of cannibalizing the same part of the mix. They're sort of blended. Now, it works really well for a stoner band to do that. And, you know, for bands like Motorhead, for example, another famous three-piece, it's a certain, like, obviously it was the bass tone sort of leaping into the guitar space here. For Matt, I think it's his guitar tone sort of moving towards the bass. But this record, to some degree, feels like soupy. And that's kind of where I was going with the, like, you know, thrash crawling out of the mud, right? Like, you know, when Swamp Thing moves out of the swamp, right? He's got a whole lot holding him back, right? He's got a whole lot of swamp to deal with. He is not like a mile down the road where the twigs and other things have fallen off. And
Kellen, would you say he's a bit bogged down?
There you go.
Well done.
Yeah. Well done. Anyway, this to me has got that kind of murkiness to it, and it aids in this kind of like ugliness to the record and to the band's sound that I think does well to drive home their identity as like this villain barbarian character. Right? Like this dude's not living in a castle being, you know, like I got this glorious spread with all his, you know, jesters. Like this dude has got a horse and a sword and like a bunch of his barbarian horde, and that's his world, right? Like that's high on fire.
Yeah, it's kind of like this comment from Drunken puts it pretty well.
For sure.
And I gotta call you out on one quick thing there, Kellen. When you're giving, like, you know, the example from, you know, castle lording everything, you could have went with knights, gold, wenches, and you went for jesters. I just gotta say,
I'm saying at his disposal or at their disposal.
Yes, but of all the things you could have mentioned at their disposal,
yes, all the figures. But
that was a great choice.
There's nothing about this dude's life that is whimsy, right? Like, and I guess that's where I'm going for is and the production drives that home. Now, I do want to mention, you mentioned his, like, the vocals here. It is 100% true. Like, there's something going on with this kind of vocal style where it's almost coming from, like, for me, probably a sludge, like Melvin's kind of style, where it's almost like a strange, I don't know how you want to describe it, like, adaptation of what, you know, if you were to go back far enough, it's like hardcore punk screaming, turn to sludge, turn to this kind of stoner thing. And it's like an augmented sort of scream thing going on here that does not have a lot to do with like extreme metal or like the sung part of like more traditional heavy metal. It's somewhere in between there. And it probably has its roots, if you were to go back far enough, into like some element of punk. For me, his vocals here feel a bit recessed in the mix. they are not front and center as a vocalist. And I don't know if that was a deliberate attempt by Billy Anderson to sort of like make sure it's guitar centric, or potentially Matt Pike as a vocalist sort of stepping into the forefront with this style and feeling less confident about who he is as a vocalist at this stage in their career. But I always felt it's a little bit buried in the mix. It's, and you really don't know what he's saying. Like there's not a lot of clarity to it. It's this weird sort of grovelly scream. But it just, for me, it drives home the whole murkiness of the record and the overall production style, from the guitars to the bass to the vocals. That sort of works in concert with one another. I love the drum sound on this record. So just you made a point earlier. I think both Jim and you, Alan, talked about drumming in this era of heavy metal. So for someone like myself, like I was consuming so much death metal at the time, which was, and kind of death metal that I love, but was all like whatever 300 beats per minute, like a lot of that super extreme, whatever, like brutal tech death that was happening at the time. So to hear a completely different drumming style that was not associated with those sort of traditional drum sort of techniques, I was all for. I actually really, in terms of Dez's approach, while very much non-traditional, I don't think it was deliberately meant to be like antagonistic towards traditional metalheads. But I know for sure your complaints were well stated. So many of the metal fans at the time were like, "Will the drummer just shut the hell up? Like, find a groove and just write it." I think you're not alone in that complaint. But the sound for his drums on this record, they sound enormous. And they don't, for me, they also don't sound like over processed. For as amplified as they sound, this is like the antithesis for the Metallica. Like that drum sound was very loud, but it also sounded sterile. I feel, right, like the tribal element of this is well suited. Those toms, it resonates in a way that like I can feel sort of the skin to them when I listen to it, and the size of that floor tom when he's striking it. So I really dig the actual drum sound on this record, and it's probably, even though it's well in terms of the better produced instruments perhaps, but I don't think as it serves as a distraction, and I don't mind its presence not only as a technical like performance from Dez, but also in terms of how noticeable it is within the mix. So I go back and forth with Blessed Black Wings because I also like the clarity of Matt's guitar playing on that a bit more. But in terms of the weight and ugliness of this record, it's a standout for me, and I dig it a lot.
Very cool. Good points. All right, Jim, what's your take on the production for Surrounded by Thieves?
Yeah, coming from, Blessed Black Wings being my favorite, the one I've listened to the most, and even though I've got all their later stuff, except actually I think I have Electric Messiah too on CD. I got one of those, like Zoller had sent Marty back in the day like a bunch of CDs, and Marty was like, "I don't know what to do these." I'm like, "Give me all the High on Fire." But I got Blessed Black Wings on vinyl. Anyway, I really like that album. I love the guitar sound on that album, and Kellen is completely correct. Like the guitar sound on that, there's a crispiness to it. There's highs there, there's definition, and I like that. I like that clarity. I can kind of understand what exactly he's doing there, and even though there's that crisp definition of the guitar, that sort of like low range of the tom work and the bass on Blessed Black Wings is still there. Like there's still a lot of bottom end going on that record. When listening to Surrounded by Thieves, all that crispiness is gone. The guitars, again, I feel like I'm parroting Kellen here, but he was exactly right. I mean, the guitars are really meshed well, or right with, well being a subjective term, or they're meshed right with the low frequencies of the drums and the bass. But somehow I don't really know how that he managed to do this. It still doesn't get buried though. There's definition, but in a different way. It's not like a crisp kind of like a cutting definition of sound like I hear on Blessed Black Wings, where the higher frequencies are what make that push through. It's just, you know, I guess the levels of the guitar, even though they're in that low range, you know, still sit in a very good place for me in the mix, like just right there with the bass. It's a 3-piece band, and I can hear all 3 of the instruments like perfectly fine the entire time, which is a huge accomplishment, you know, for any band. And let's face it, most bands don't even try to do that. You know, you're in a certain part of a song. Well, hey, we really want this one to sound, this particular section to be triumphant. Let's do another guitar track right here, or let's layer on a melody line right here. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. I'm totally fine with that. This album, not so much. You know, whether it was intentional or not, there is sort of like an equilibrium here between those 3 instruments that I think is pervasive from beginning to end. And Matt's vocal, again, to Colin's point, he's right. Like it's just kind of there, like riding along with it. It's not out front, and like it would be with Blessed Black Wings. It didn't really bother me though. I still kind of enjoyed it. It did take me back as a whole, the production, because I was expecting more of like the Blessed Black Wings sound, and I'm like, whoa, this is, again, this I keep thinking about Masters of Reality, and all you stoner fans are like, well, there's more to stoner metal than old Black Sabbath, and I'm like, nah, okay. But that's what it makes me. That's what I think about. You know, I mean, I love old Black Sabbath. It makes me think about Masters of Reality. It sounds like that, but heavier and faster. And that is not a dig. I love that record. You know, I mean, I've never stopped listening to it since the first time I heard it. And I do think that a lot of metal riffs from many genres come from that one album, in some way or shape or form, or influenced by it. So I think that you know, this production is a great sort of like, you know, preview of what could be with Blessed Black Wings. And because I think for that album, for me, again, you know, I'm biased. That was my favorite record. I feel like that was where everything just kind of fell into place. You know, that said, you know, I think in terms of like an evolution of their sound, this production is right on. And I even though it was kind of, you know, a little like, wait, I wasn't expecting it at first to be so bassy and mid-rangey, like low end, you know, all that kind of like left side of the EQ. I quickly adjusted to it and enjoyed it. And I feel like, you know, for what High on Fire embodies and where they came from and where they were going, it was just right. I kind of wouldn't change anything about it. I really like it. Yeah, I just have no complaints about it. You know, I know that sounds kind of boring, but I mean, honestly, I just couldn't find really anything to nitpick about production. It fits for this.
No, that makes sense. And yeah, I'm kind of on the same page as, you know, the two of you. You know, Kellen described it well. Yeah, it's a very murky, very soupy kind of sound, but it doesn't obliterate the instruments. You can still hear things. Yeah, the drum sound is, you know, pretty loud, but that works because, as we talked about earlier, you know, the drums are one of the things that are really giving these songs energy and helping always push them forward. So it's good that they're a little bit loud. If they were, you know, a little quiet or stuck further back in the mix, they'd have a much harder time pushing this whole thing, you know, up out of that swamp. As such, you know, with the sound they've got, they're always up front just enough that you never feel like the song is, you know, slowly starting to get stuck. Instead, it's always moving along. I also think, you know, this kind of, you know, production sound, it works well for what they're wanting to deliver here. Going back to that kind of, they're wanting it to, you know, be sort of, you know, the darker, grimier, you know, side of, you know, epic doom stoner stuff. That wouldn't work as well with a really clean production. It's where for me, the St. Vitus comparison comes back in. That it's got that same kind of tone that you hear on old Vitus tracks, like, War is Our Destiny, where, it's kind of fuzzed out. It's, got, this, heavy vibe to it, but the songs are still moving forward too. It's not just getting lost in that sound. It's using that just to sound kind of big and monstrous. Well, there's enough aggression in the song and enough of a push to always, keep you moving forward. To your point, Jim, that's something I noticed looking around at different reviews online this week for different High on Fire albums. A lot of people seem to be, in that same conundrum, that you've laid out, that if they started with Blessed Black Wings, or that's their favorite, then the production on this album, it does throw them for just a little bit of a loop, because it's like, yeah, it's really different before Blessed. But if they started with this one, then they're like, yeah, they had this, really cool, fuzzy stoner sound. And then all of a sudden it just got cleaned up on the next album. And it was really strange. So definitely a big change seemed to happen between those two albums that seems like people can appreciate both styles without too much trouble. But yeah, there was a noticeable difference in what they did. But I think for this album, the production they went with, even though your knee-jerk reaction would be to say, like, that just sounds really thick. That just sounds really fuzzy. I think it suits the music really well, and I think it helps achieve the purpose. It, back to your point, Colin, that they're trying to really nail that they want this certain identity or this certain image. The production for this is perfect. It gets that point across much better than a super clean production would. And you see that kind of in other bands too, with Vitus. What's the one St. Vitus album a lot of people complain about? Children of Doom. Why do they complain about it? The production's too clean. They lose that element. And I really like that element on High on Fire. I think it's why I like this album a lot more after the first handful of listens compared to Blessed Black Wings. This album wants to be kind of a gritty, grimy, sludgy thing. And they've got the production to fit it and really drive that point home. All right. I do believe it is time for us to choose some favorite and least favorite songs. So, Kellen, which tracks stand out to you on this one, both good and bad?
Okay, so Hung, Drawn, and Quartered is probably my favorite High on Fire song, potentially ever. But it's up there at least. So, but I love that track. It's the first one I heard. Just the empty drums that begin it, and then it just launches into something powerful. So, love that track. The other one that I really dig. So, there's two more that I will say are standout. Thraft. I have no idea what a thraft is. If anyone can enlighten me, please let me know. But Thraft of Canaan. That one starts slow, and there's this cool sort of empty section where like the toms like build in it. One of my favorite sort of moments on the entire record. And Alan, I am so happy you are here for this, because we get to come back to a previous heavy metallurgy episode where we listened to St. Vitus Die Healing, and there was an animal, the sloth, that showed up on that record. And we have the Doom record for this one is Yeti. So the Yeti on this one is we get to have another sort of well, one's potentially fictional. In the eyes of Matt Pike, it may be very real. But that's like the Doom sort of slow, like drawn out heavy track for me on this album. It's got that crazy like Yeti scream to begin that goes off. But those three tracks for me are like the standout and offer the greatest amount of like diversity. The Hung, Drawn, and Quartered being on like the faster side of things to the Yeti being on the slower side. Then Thraft of Canaan is kind of in the middle. I really don't have tracks that I necessarily dislike, but there are moments where, for example, like Speedwolf is sort of bookended by two of my favorite songs on the entire record. And usually when I'm listening to it, I kind of breeze over it. There's some other tracks here that just feel less. I even think the title track Surrounded by Thieves is less of a standout for me. But none of them are necessarily bad or a letdown. It's just, relative to some of the albums or tracks that serve as pillars on the record. They sort of kind of fill in the time in between, like the moments where I'm really looking forward to the next track. So, yep, those three are probably my favorites, and the rest not bad, but not as good.
Okay. Say, Jim, what are your picks for favorite and least favorite?
A little similar to Kellen. I actually also really love Hung, Drawn, and Quartered. I think it's a great song. Every time it would come on, it would draw me in. To Kellen's point, that drum intro at the beginning, it just pulls you in. It's one of the heaviest songs on the record. There's just tons of energy in that. You really get a sense of like what defines High on Fire on that song. I also like Thraft of Canaan. It's got a kind of a good bouncy sort of a main riff that reminds me of like Reverend Bizarre. Great vocal from Matt on that. I like it. I love his vocal on that. There's like about 5 minutes in, it's a longer track on the record. There's like this cool dissonant riff that you don't really expect, like a dissonant sounding, and it brings attention to the song that you kind of weren't anticipating, and I love that surprise there. And there's some really cool bass work too on there. The bass player kind of goes off near the end of the song. Not in like a very showy way, but just like, yeah, man, I got a little bit of geezer going on here. Yeah, I can do it. You know what I mean? And it's very impressive. So yeah, Thraft of Canaan, definitely a killer song. Here where I differ with Kellen is I actually really do like Surrounded by Thieves. There's one of the main riffs in the song. It does this descending thing. It's like I like how it just descends like that, and I'm just kind of like I'm riding along that train with them on it. So so for me it's those three. And also the end of Eyes and Teeth, because like I said, I heard a little bit of Frost in there, baby. And so yeah, first track, you get in there at the end, it's awesome, and it kind of just gets better from there. The only song I not so much into is Razorhoof. I think that like the first part of the song is really, really cool. It just isn't like super interesting compared to me as compared to what was before. It's not a bad closer. This isn't one of those like, oh, it's a bad closer, or they screwed up the album. It's not like that. It is a High on Fire song, and it isn't a bad tune, but there's this weird thing they do at the end where it's like they're funneling the drum signal through a distortion pedal, and it's like going and my opinion on that is the same opinion I had when I talked last week about like singing when they do a vocalist through a distorted sound. It just sounds so contrived to me. Like I can't stand it. Like I leave the distortion for the guitars. That's what I like. So for me, Razorhoof kind of at the end of that song kind of kills it for me a little bit. I'm just kind of waiting for it to end. But yeah, still Hung, Drawn, and Quartered, Thraft of Canaan, title track. Excellent songs. Check them out.
Okay. Good list. Let's see. For me, the album's pretty consistent throughout. Yeah, there's not a lot of dips or anything. Kellen described it pretty well. There's moments I like better, and there's some in between that. It's like, okay, I'm kind of waiting for the next, slightly stronger song. I like the way the album starts. The opening pair, Eyes and Teeth and Hung, Drawn, and Quartered. It really establishes the sound and what they're going to do right off the bat with a good solid 1-2 punch to it. The Yeti is a really kind of fun song. I like the sloth reference. Yes, it's reminiscent of some of those crazy heavy doomy characters from like Saint Vitus tracks and others. Yeah, and the fact that also he managed to work flying saucer references into the lyrics at the same time, it's just like, okay, we're going there. It's not just an abominable snowman; it's an alien abominable snowman.
Matt loves the acid man,
and we can all dig that. So yeah, it's one of like the little bit more of the not just stoner but maybe slightly psychedelic moments getting worked in there. So it's a fun song. Thraft of Canaan, also one that I liked a bit. It's a little different. Lyrically, it definitely goes for a little bit more of a trippy vibe than some of the other songs. That was something that I was interested in. Given this band is people always sort of want to reference all the drug use and the stoner background and all that. I was expecting a lot more of that stuff throughout the lyrics, and there's some here and there, but a lot of the lyrics are a little bit more what you described earlier, Kellen. It's the kind of tribal, barbaric, orcish warfare going on more so than just constant, dude, pass the fucking bong, man, kind of stuff. But Thereafter Canaans, got, a little bit more of a, kind of laid back vibe to it, but works really well musically. And Jim, I would differ on Razorhoof. I like that one as the closer. I know what you're saying about that weird part at the ending, but I feel like it's a good closer just in the fact that it goes right back to reinforcing that real primal thud that they're wanting to establish as their identity. That, it's a relatively simple song compared to some of the others. The lyrics, are very repetitive on this one, but it really just kind of helps, drive it home that, look, this is, bear skins and stone knives kind of heavy metal. And that's what we're going to wallow in, and you're going to like it. For a least favorite track, there wasn't anything that I thought was terrible. Looking at the track list right now, I think kind of like Kellen, I think Speed Wolf gets lost on me a little bit just because you got that great 1-2 punch. I like that. And then I know the Yeti's coming, which, well, not necessarily a favorite, is just kind of a fun song. And so Speed Wolf, I think, is the track that I kind of gloss over. It happens a little bit to Nemesis as well, but Nemesis has a little more punch to it. So I do notice that song going by. I don't always register Speed Wolf. So I guess for that reason, I'll pick Speed Wolf as the least favorite, but it's certainly not a bad track. All right, gentlemen, that means we are down to judgments and final thoughts on Surrounded by Thieves. Kellen, let's bring you back up for your closing statements here.
Yeah, well, I mean, I picked it, so I dig it. And
that's good to know you weren't trolling us.
Yes. I wasn't deliberately trying to get you to throw hot trash at me. But yeah, I mean, I think this briefly we talked about on the Elder episode, where this is a band for me personally, the outside of like my personal attachment to the era in which they sort of came up in, that serves as an example of how like I could potentially get into a sound, or they incorporate a specific genre with enough kind of heavy metal influence where I no longer get this confused with necessarily like is it rock or is it metal? Like High on Fire for me clearly was a heavy metal band. And I out of the records, once they left Relapse, and Death is a Communion was the last record they put out through Relapse, it's for me like a band that I kind of let go of. Snakes for the Divine came out, and Greg Fiddleman, who's the Metallica producer, jumped on, and I was like, oh, okay, well, go ahead and get your Grammy. But because, my time with them is, kind of come to an end, but that was in 2000. And so Snakes for the Divine is 2010, I believe. And Death is a Communion is 2007. So Surrounded by Thieves comes around at a time in my life where it was incredibly impactful. And I love this early era of this band. I agree. Like they have a unique sound. In terms of position and where to position them is kind of difficult, but it's only because I think in an era in which bands who were doing the heavy stoner doom thing, they were far too aggressive. And for bands who were, we want to be, whatever, thinking man's metal, they were too primitive. They just kind of hit a nice sweet spot for me. And I think as a consequence, they've aged relatively well. But for me, Surrounded by Thieves is one of the best in the catalog. And if you're getting into the band, it's not a bad place to start. So high recommendation. And I totally dig the record.
All right. Let's see. Jim, your concluding remarks on this one. It's interesting that, as a big fan of the band, you weren't familiar with this. So I'm interested to hear what you.
For some reason, I had the debut on like a Burn CD, and then I had everything after that on CD after, but I didn't have this one, which is really weird. But no, I actually really like this one. In fact, I like it some better than some of the later stuff. To Kellen's point, but I don't like it better than Blessed Black Wings. I still like that one the best. And because, I'm a thrash kid, I love that thrash sound. And so when Matt started, putting that more to the forefront, like I really identified with it really a lot. And so though that one is my favorite, this is still a very solid record. I was excited about hearing some High on Fire that I wasn't familiar with, and it didn't disappoint. Very easy for me to throw this in, very easy for me to work with this in the background. As aggressive as this music is, because of the warmth of the sound of the production, like it's not like threatening on my ears when I'm trying to, concentrate at work and stuff. So it made for a good, daily listen. And so, final thoughts is, if you're a High on Fire fan and you're like me and you don't have it, pick it up. Do I think it's essential? I don't know that I think it's essential. Because I think if you've got Blasted Black Wings, you got the essential one. But I do think it's a really solid record, and I certainly would pick it up if I ran across it, for a decent price. So it's a good record.
All right, good deal. Let's see. In closing, one thing I have to get off my chest that we didn't touch on here, cover artwork. I really like the orange and black color scheme. The big gray figures, though, I never have liked orange and gray on album covers. That's a tough sell for me. But I do like the fact that, and it's orcs, which kind of again goes back to they're not depicting the knights or the heroes. They're kind of depicting the cannon fodder for the bad guys. But it doesn't jive with the album title. They're not surrounded by thieves. I mean, you're in the middle of full out orcish combat here. So I don't know. There's something about the album title and the cover art there's a little bit of a disconnect for me, but it's a relatively minor complaint. I just wanted to throw out there.
What if it was dark figures with orange pumpkins? Would that be enough?
Why would Thieves have pumpkins?
All right. I was trying to give you your Halloween.
No, it's so good. But yeah, if it was dark, like the figures in the background, if they all had like the long knives instead of carrying the big banners and stuff, it would click a little bit more. But yeah, just little nitpicky things that you notice while you're looking at the album all week. But other than that, again, came into this with only knowing one other album by the band and not really connecting with that album at all. So wasn't sure what to expect here, but after playing this one a handful of times throughout the week, I like it. I like this production better for this band. I like, what they were going for here. I can connect with that, kind of, Vitus-y Gates of Slumber angle, just, processed through more of a sludge filter rather than, a more traditional Doom or Epic filter. So that all works for me just fine. This is one that, yeah, orcs could be thieves, but the big dude in gray there, thieves don't carry giant axes. His weaponry, is completely wrong. He needs +5 backstabbing dagger, not the +3 dwarf skull splitting axe. So no, can't sell me on that guy being a thief. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think this is a pretty cool album in this style. It's not a style I visit often, but I will probably pick this one up at some point. It's going to be one of those I'll wait for it to show up in the used bin, and or if it's repressed and it's a new copy, but it's like the $11.99 kind of thing. Yeah, I can see myself picking this up, put it on the shelf, and when I'm in the mood for this style, I think this one will get a spin from time to time. So a cool album. Glad I got a chance to check it out because, yeah, after my experience with Blessed Black Wings, wasn't really prone to wanting to go a lot much further in the band's catalog. But folks had mentioned that some of the other albums sounded different. I think this is a good point. And yeah, I'll have to go contrary to Jim, and I'll have to side with this one, liking it more than Blessed Black Wings. But he knows the catalog much better than I, so listen to what he has to say about the band. Don't take my word for it. All right, that brings us to the end of things. Jim, Kellen, thank you very much for joining us for this. Been a cool discussion. a neat dive on a band that we hadn't touched on before. Thanks to everybody in the chat. There's been a lot of good comments. Some folks that have a really strong connection to this band. Kellen, you're not alone in having this band resonate very strongly with you. Folks like Drunken Metalhead have mentioned that. Tommy mentioned that. I haven't seen Brian in the chat tonight, but I think he posted something earlier. I missed it, and then it got taken down for some reason. But yeah, he mentioned that he was a huge High on Fire fan. So this is an important band for a lot of folks, that came up on heavy metal in the early 2000s. So it's been a cool one to check in on. But with that, we have to move on to the future. And for next week, Jim, I do believe it is your turn to choose an album for everybody to check out. So where are we going on the next album club?
Well, I have two in my hand, and I can't decide which one I want to pull. Like
the one on the left.
All right, the one on the left. All right, we're gonna go to the Ultraviolence, guys. We're gonna go to Death. We're gonna go to Death Angel's debut, 1987. We're going to talk about this.
You're really going to pick the album that features 14-year-old child labor?
Yes, yep. A bunch of kids. But I bought this on cassette when it came out, and it was impressive what they were doing. And I still think it holds up, man. I think they smoked a lot of other thrash bands in '87 at the time. So I'll be interested to hear what you guys think of it. So
that will be a cool one to discuss. Yes. Next Wednesday, Marty and TJ should be back. I will probably be back to lurking in the comments and checking it out with everybody else. We're still discussing orc possibilities. That raiding party is too big to be. Bandits don't carry those big banner flag things. Bandits don't want you to know they're coming. That's obviously a war party that's trying to announce their presence. So sorry, North. I'm not sold on them being bandits either. But I like that folks are trying to get there. I like the input for sure. But with that, let's bring this one to a close. Jim, Kellen, we'll see you next week. To other folks, Marty's obviously been very busy with a lot of other concerts and stuff here lately, but we've still got reviews coming out on Heavy Metallurgy. Melanie's got a review up recently. We'll be on. Let's see. Marty will be on Friday night. Now, I am not available this week. I've got a wedding to go to. Not a very metal thing to do, but yeah, I'll be doing that. So I'll be taking this Friday night off from Heavy Metallurgy, but Marty will be on with some other folks. Don't know if he's got the lineup nailed down yet. So we'll leave that for you to find out when the time comes later in the week. Until then, everybody take care. And this is where I'm supposed to insert some kind of tagline that we've never developed. So we'll just go with, darkened, grimy, swampy orc chickens crawling out of the muck. Everybody take care. Have a good weekend. Nice. Gotta love that Southern fried sludge chicken.